Well, hello from me and our newest little blessing, the newest addition to our family. This is Reid James. He just got to sleep, so we'll see if he stays napping for this whole video. Almost 3 months old, and if you saw my last video, you'll know a little bit of the story as to why I took a few months off of YouTube. I am thrilled to be back, and I'm so excited to sit down today and share our birth story with you. I love hearing other women's birth stories, especially encouraging and uplifting ones, and I really hope that this story can be that as well for you if you are expecting, especially if you're expecting your first baby. I dealt with a lot of fear before having our 2 babies, and I know that I'm not alone in that, and so I really want our story to be an encouragement to you. And if you're visiting here for the first time, then welcome. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Laura. I am a mom to 2 little boys, and on this corner of the internet you will see little glimpses into my life, into my creative pursuits as an artist. I have all of my artwork available on my Etsy shop, and I love to just share encouragement, especially in motherhood and in homemaking. So if that sounds like a season that you are in, then I would love for you to join and subscribe. Well, to start for this story, for our birth story, I really need to begin a couple weeks before Reid was born, because that is essentially when our story started. I went in for a routine ultrasound at around 32 weeks, I think, or 34 weeks, because they wanted to check something about the umbilical cord. Not really a big deal, but they wanted to do a follow-up ultrasound. So I went in for that, and at that ultrasound they discovered, or the technician noted, that the ventricles, a few ventricles in his brain were enlarged, and so they made note of that. And then my midwife suggested that we send my scans to a more specialized hospital to see what they would have to say. And as it turned out, they wanted me to come in for another ultrasound. So we went in for that ultrasound. I believe that was at 37 weeks, and they did find that his ventricles were slightly enlarged, and that whole visit was very confusing because the doctor was expressing that he wasn't concerned, but he wanted us to still transfer to this hospital. They have a more specialized fetal medicine and maternal ward, and so he wanted us to transfer. And so we were just confused because it wasn't seeming like it was a huge deal or that there were risks, but he still wanted us to transfer and go under his care. And I was super apprehensive because I really wanted to stay with my midwives in our local hospital that I had been to before with our first baby. It was just very familiar and comfortable to me. So essentially we decided to just stick it out with our midwives where we were, because there weren't really any risks for him. But he did want us to come back for a follow-up ultrasound, which ended up being at 39 weeks, which going for an ultrasound at 39 weeks is just, it's just not fun. So I went there, and thankfully the enlargement in the ventricles had decreased slightly. They were still a little bit, it was maybe a little bit big still, but they weren't concerned. They just suggested that we have an ultrasound on Reid's head after he was born, but we confirmed that was something that we could do at our local hospital, so there was no need to transfer. So we were super thankful for that. And again, this was at 39 weeks, so then the game plan was just the same, to just wait for him to come. And so all through that next week, I wasn't having that many symptoms of going into labor. Just a quick note, I was induced with our first son at 41.5 weeks. So just because I was past my due date, I was induced. And so this time I really didn't want to be induced. I wanted to, even though my experience with our son Danny was great, I really just wanted to go into labor naturally just to experience what that would be like. And so I was doing all the things. I was walking, I was bouncing on my ball, I was eating dates and trying everything to encourage labor to start. I was having like some period cramps, but nothing crazy. So I had a midwife checkup that I don't remember what day that would have been, but I was 39 and a few days. I had a checkup and she did do I think it's like a stretch and sweep, which did send me cramping a little bit, but nothing really happened. At this point, my husband had asked me like, at what point do you think we would go get induced? Oh, and I should have mentioned this was a big part. Because of the things that showed up with Reid's brain, the specialist wanted me to get induced at like 38 weeks, but we just wanted to hold off because it just didn't seem like it was a big enough problem to get induced. Anyways, because of all that, we essentially had the option on the table to go ahead and get induced. So it was just sort of in our field of deciding if we wanted to or not. So that's why my husband asked, like, at what point do you think you would want to get induced? Because at this point, my family had come to stay with us for 2 weeks and they had been with us for a number of days. We really wanted to have Reid while they were here so that they could, of course, meet him and also help out with Danny, with our toddler. And so it was seeming like labor wasn't really gonna start soon. And so we started talking about getting induced. And just to kind of encourage things along, I just had the sense that like my body was close, it was getting there, but it just wasn't starting yet. So I had many calls with my midwives just trying to figure out what was the best call. And in the end, we did decide to go ahead with an induction. Also, this was a long weekend. I forget why, but the Monday was a holiday, so they were encouraging that if we were going to get induced to go in before the weekend, because over the weekend there's just fewer people on staff, fewer nurses, all of that. So it was kind of like we were thinking of going either Thursday or Friday or waiting until the following Tuesday, and my parents were leaving that Friday, I believe. So that only would have given us a few days with them. So we decided to go ahead and get induced on the Friday, which was also his due date, which was also Valentine's Day, which I really did not want him to be born on Valentine's Day. I don't know, I just didn't want a holiday birthday. Essentially, that was kind of the only option. It just seemed like it would be the best fit. So thankfully at my midwife appointment, I was far enough along that I didn't need to go in for any cervical ripening, which I did do with my first. I didn't have to do that this time, which was so wonderful because it meant that I could get a full night's sleep that night before. With my first, I got the Folly balloon, and so I was just cramping that whole night. So I didn't do that, and that was awesome because I woke up on the Friday rested, ready to go. I was excited, so of course a little bit nervous. It's just such a weird feeling knowing that you are like just getting ready to go have a baby. It's very weird when it's planned because it's like, oh, I just have an appointment to go have a baby. It's a very strange feeling. So we got there around 9, I believe, and my midwife was actually like over a half hour late because her driveway was completely snowed in. She had to shovel her driveway. There had been so much snow that week. So she ended up getting there. We got into the room all settled and got started on the Pitocin. I got the IV in and everything. It was all very familiar because I had this same experience of getting induced with our first. Okay, I need to refer to my notes. So at 10 a.m. I got started on Pitocin. At this point, I should have mentioned, I was 2 centimeters dilated. So a few days earlier, I was only 1 centimeter when she did the stretch and sweep. So at this point, I was 2 centimeters, which was encouraging. And for the next couple hours, really nothing happened. I didn't feel anything. I was not feeling contractions. I could see that there were like contractions on the monitor, but it was just very uneventful, and honestly boring. And I was getting like just a little discouraged because I'm like, something should be happening by now, and it just wasn't. So at that point, around at 1 p.m., my midwife suggested that we break my waters. So this would have been just 3 hours after getting started. She wanted to break my waters, and I was kind of taken aback because I didn't have this with my son. They just broke naturally. And so I was like, oh, I don't really know if I want to. I want to just wait and see if things keep progressing or start progressing. And so we waited around for another hour and nothing was happening. Like, I wasn't feeling contractions. I was just walking around, like, just hoping something would start. And so I did decide to have my waters broken because that can just encourage the baby to descend and to just progress in labor. So at 2 p.m. I did have my waters broken, which was not a big deal. I was worried about it. I thought it would hurt. It didn't hurt at all. So my waters broke, and then immediately after that, I was like almost 4 centimeters. So having those waters broken just helped things to just move along a bit. So I was like 3 to 4 centimeters. And then for the next 2 hours, I just sat on my birth ball. I walked around. I was going to the bathroom, like peeing as often as I could. And I was still drinking, I was still eating, and kind of just hanging around for the next couple of hours. I was talking fine. I was just experiencing like those crampy sort of contractions. Nothing crazy. It was just all very manageable, and I was just trying to fuel as much as possible, stay hydrated, go to the bathroom, and just encourage things along. So lots of walking, standing, bouncing on my ball. I think at this point we watched a show on the laptop with my husband, sort of hanging around waiting for things to happen. And at this point, my midwife asked if I was planning to get an epidural, which I did have an epidural with my first, and so it was something that I was sort of banking on that I would do again because it was a good experience. So I said that yes, I would like an epidural, and she had talked with the anesthesiologist, and he had a surgery at 5. So I was kind of like, you could get it before then or wait until after. And at this point, I'm like, I'm feeling fine. Like, I don't think I'll need it in like an hour. But I said, well, why don't we just like schedule him to come before that surgery, so that just in case if I want it then I can have it. And thank goodness that I did, because things picked up quick. I essentially just started having around 4:30. I started having, I think it was 4:30, at 4 o'clock actually. At 4 o'clock, my contractions intensified. We had been watching our show, and I just couldn't listen to it anymore. It was starting to annoy me. I was rolling on the ball, and I wasn't able to talk through these contractions I was experiencing, and it felt like they were coming quick, which I know can happen with getting induced, and that's essentially what was happening. They were coming quick, and I couldn't talk through them. But what was helpful was just being like on the floor with my like leaning over onto the birth ball and just rolling, and I was like moaning through them. I couldn't talk. I didn't want anyone touching me. I was definitely progressing in labor. I didn't know it yet, but I was in transition. That's why they were so intense. And so I did end up, I was so thankful that the anesthesiologist came. I got the epidural at just before 5. And this was where things started to get just different, because he placed it quite high on my back, which was just strange because I remember with Danny it was lower, and for whatever reason this was just higher up. So I was noticing that it was hard while he was doing it. I was really nervous that I would move because these contractions were hurting so bad, but thankfully Silas helped me. I like hugged a pillow. It all went fine, and thankfully he got it in no problem. And then I laid down and I just got the shakes, which I know is normal when it's like taking effect, but I was just like so shaky. And I don't know if it was totally because of the epidural or also just because I was in transition and I didn't know it yet, but I was just shaking uncontrollably. And my midwife kept saying like, just like I'm trying to remember, was she saying yeah, she was saying to let the shakes happen, like don't resist it, to just like relax, let them happen. But I just felt so tense because it was just like the shakes. It was very strange. And I got laid down on my side in the hospital bed and I was comfortable, but I was just shaking. And then this pressure started happening very soon after getting the epidural. So at 5:30, my midwife checked me and I was 7 centimeters. And so essentially I was laying on my right side and I was 7 centimeters, still having the shakes a little bit, but I was like feeling just pressure still, and I was confused because I had the epidural, but it almost seemed like it wasn't taking effect really below like my belly button. It was up higher, which makes sense because it was placed higher on my back. At this point, my midwife, I think she was obviously cluing in that things were moving along kind of quickly. So she was checking the position of him in my belly and was saying that he wasn't positioned greatly. I forget where he was. I think she needed him to like rotate around. I don't know exactly, but essentially she propped up my leg while I was lying on my side. She like wedged the peanut ball in between my legs and like pulled my leg. She just like positioned me in a way to get him to rotate. And within a minute or two, she was like, yep, he turned, he rotated, and things were happening. I was feeling this intense pressure. This was at 5:30. So at 5:30, yeah, I was still 7 centimeters at 5:30. She turned or helped me to turn the baby, and I immediately started feeling this pressure after he turned. And I was getting nervous because I thought like I still have hours to go. There's no way that I can endure this pressure. And I just kept saying like, there's this pressure, like there's so much pressure. And my midwife said like, there's nothing we can do about pressure. Like that's not helpful. But it was just so intense and there wasn't any relief really. I wasn't feeling the contractions in my abdomen because of the epidural, so that was helpful. Again, it was just this pressure. I don't know how many times I said like, I feel pressure. And I didn't know it, but it was because he was descending like so low. And oh my goodness, I'll never forget that feeling of him just being so low. And I was just thinking like, I have hours to go. Like there's no way that this is gonna go this fast. Like I remember I was anticipating that he would be born at like midnight that night. For whatever reason, I just thought it would just take a while. So I was continuing to feel this pressure, specifically rectal pressure, if that's TMI, sorry, but that's what it was. And we later found out when he was born that his hand was up by his face, by his chin. So that's why the pressure was so intense, because I was nearing full dilation. But again, I didn't know it. So my midwife checked me again. And at this point, she definitely knew what was happening. She knew like labor was approaching because she had gone ahead and called the secondary midwife. I didn't even know any of this. I was in my own world. But around 6:30, she checked me again and I was so close to being a 10. There was just a little lip that she helped to get out of the way. And the secondary midwife came just in time to start pushing. I pushed for less than 10 minutes. I think it was like 8 minutes. I'm so thankful because it was intense, because I think the epidural was just so much higher that I was feeling lots of pressure. How many times I'm going to say the word pressure in this video, but truly that's just what it was. It was very intense. It was much more intense than my first birth because I was just much more frozen that time. This time I hadn't had the epidural for long. It had only been an hour. It was high up and I hadn't like upped the dose at all. Like it was just the basic, I don't know, just the epidural. It hadn't been upped at all. So it was very intense pushing. I'm so thankful for my husband who was encouraging me. He was just talking me through it, and this whole process was just much more intense than my first birth, probably because I could feel more and because it just happened so quickly. It was like I don't know, with my first, it just progressed very gradually. It was just very steady. And this was like 0 to 100, it felt like. So I felt like I didn't have time to process what was happening. I was just like pushing a baby out. And so thankfully I pushed for, like I said, about 8 minutes, and he was born at 6:40, around 6:40. It was wild. It was just so quick, and I felt like I was in a little bit of shock. Like I was excited, but I was just like floored that he was here. It was just crazy. But nothing can replace that feeling of seeing that baby, feeling him, holding him in your hands, putting him on your chest. There's just nothing in this world that is like that feeling, and just the intense feelings of gratitude and just thankfulness. And I remember praying in that moment, like, thank you, Lord, that he is here. Hearing his cries is just the best sound in the world, just knowing that this human that you've grown for 9 months inside of you is with you. You can hold him, and he's okay, and he's here. And I think just everything that we had gone through those last few weeks with the ultrasounds and talking to specialists and maybe having to transfer and worrying that something was wrong with his brain, it was just such a huge relief to just hold him and to see that he was okay. Everything went smoothly, and I just remember thanking the Lord in that moment, like actually praying and thanking him that he was here. And it was also really nice that I didn't have the epidural for very long. It was only in for like an hour, and so I was like really quickly able, not really quickly, but like within an hour or two, like very much myself. With my first, I had the epidural for a number of hours and was so swollen after he was born. I was just more swollen in pregnancy anyways, but I think the epidural contributed to that, and I didn't experience that this time. I wasn't swollen. I just felt kind of back to normal, back to myself. So we got settled into our like maternal hospital room, and it was just such a whirlwind, but we were in there, and we knew that we were gonna have like his 24-hour newborn screening checkup, and that they would also do another head ultrasound just to check his ventricles to make sure everything was okay. And so they came, I don't even remember what time, like maybe 10 or 12 hours after he was born. Not even, because it was that night. It was like at midnight, I think. They did this ultrasound on him, and essentially they came back. The pediatrician came with my midwife, and he explained that the ventricles all looked fine, but that the technician had noted that there was a brain bleed in Reid's brain. And so they were obviously very concerned. We were concerned because that's very alarming to hear that your newborn has a bleed in his brain. And so this was at like midnight, so we were like so deliriously tired at this point. We've had such a high of seeing our son born and holding him, and then just like this news just totally, I felt like, shattered our worlds, because we were like, okay, this sounds super serious. When you talk about bleeding in the brain, like that's not good. So I just felt crushed. I was just scared. Honestly, I was just so scared, and they essentially just left. The pediatrician was going to call the like specialist hospital and talk with some neurologists and figure out what to do. So we essentially were just left like, we have no idea what's gonna happen. We don't know if something is wrong with him. And I just remember looking at my newborn baby and just feeling this sense of like, I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what is going to happen. There's no way that I can help him, and just crying. And I was just so scared. And I'm so thankful for Silas in that moment, who just took my hands, who put his hands on Reid and just prayed out loud, asking God to watch over us, to be near to us. And he just demonstrated such faithfulness in that moment, which was just so powerful and helpful for me, feeling so worried and anxious. And Silas looked me in the eyes and he said, like, God is in control. He knows every detail of the situation. He knows what is going on. He is watching over us. And that just assurance just washed over me, just completely flooded me. And I knew that it was going to be okay no matter what happened, that God was in control. And Silas immediately put on this song that has carried me through pregnancies, all of the anxious thoughts and worries and fears. And I just have to read you some of the lyrics because this has to be one of my favorite songs because it has been so meaningful and was just the words that I needed to hear. It's from Psalm 121, which of course I was memorizing at the time, and I'm so thankful because these words just came to me through this song. It says, "I lift my eyes and see, I need not be afraid. All my help comes from the Lord, whom the earth and sky has made. The Lord will never sleep, my steps he has ordained, for the one who holds the night is the sovereign of my days. He will keep you from all evils, behind you and before. He will sustain you through this journey from now and evermore." This song just was so impactful in those moments. And we honestly just felt a peace. We felt a peace that God was in control. We texted our families to ask them to pray, and we just waited to hear further news. And then later on in that night, the doctors came back, but all throughout this time, like, I was having just the hardest time starting to feed Reid. Watching him was just not happening, and so I was very stressed because it just wasn't happening. And I honestly just felt like, even though I'd been through all this before, I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. I felt like a first-time mom all over again, which was something that I didn't expect, because I feel like you hear a lot of people say, like, it just comes back to you, and it just didn't. For whatever reason, I just felt paralyzed in those like 12 hours. And because he wasn't really nursing, they were concerned about that. So essentially the doctor came back, and so he expressed to us that he had talked with all of these doctors and they had gone through every possibility of what this brain bleed could possibly mean, and that they just wanted to do a couple tests, one test in particular to just check Reid's like blood clotting, if maybe he had a blood disorder, a blood clotting disorder, because that could mean have more serious ramifications if his blood wouldn't clot. So we had this test done and it all came back normal. It was all fine. So I think that set them at peace, because essentially the pediatrician came to us and said, like, he talked to these doctors, they basically like don't really know what it could be, but that their main concern was that he wasn't feeding, so that we needed to get feeding established. And so this was all just like so overwhelming because I'm trying to feed my baby and I can't, and I'm worried about his brain. It was a very uncertain time, but we were also concerned about his jaundice levels, which came back very high, which we did like delay his cord clamping significantly. So that I know sometimes can cause higher bilirubin in the blood, and so they were really wanting us to get going on feeding to help flush that bilirubin out, but that just wasn't happening. So we did end up giving him a bottle there in the hospital because I was just so stressed and worried that he wasn't feeding and that his jaundice levels were just going to get higher and higher. So we ended up staying 2 nights actually, just because of these tests and things to get done. And when we were discharged, we had to come back the next day to have his jaundice levels checked again, and we ended up having to come back 4 or 5 times to the hospital. We did end up doing the light therapy for a day, for about 8 hours, because his levels were increasing. And all through this time I was pumping. My milk came in pretty quick, like within 48 hours. So I was pumping and we were bottle feeding, and it was just a crazy time because every time we went back to the hospital, it was like 5-hour visits waiting for the lab results and everything. And it was just hard to go back and forth. It was hard to leave our son here for all of this time. We felt like we just didn't even see him that whole first week because we were back to the hospital so much. But thankfully, with the feedings and the light therapy, his levels did start to come down. We still had to come back twice just to make sure, but he was progressing in the right direction. But then they were concerned about his weight, that he wasn't gaining enough weight. And so I just felt like we just had this extra stress in that first week, which is a lot when you're also dealing with hormone shifts and trying to figure out feeding and also having another baby at home to think about. So it was a lot, but I'm so thankful in that my parents were still with us. I'm thankful that all of this took place and that he was born a full week before they had to leave, because it meant that they could stay with Danny, they could just help out at home. We didn't need to worry about any of that. It was such a comfort and such a blessing that God ordained it that way. And then finally his levels, as they started to come down, there was another pediatrician that we met with at the hospital, and she went over all of his records from the hospital. She went over all of the brain stuff, and she came in and she told us essentially, I'll never forget, she said, "I hope that you're not worried about this brain bleed, because it is the tiniest amount." And she said it's completely an incidental finding. Like, if there was an ultrasound done on every newborn baby, they would find so many more, and that it was likely just a result of being born, that it was just this tiny bleed that was just really insignificant. And if he hadn't had an ultrasound, we never would have known about it. And so that was a huge relief coming from this doctor. I'm so thankful that she took the time to come tell us that. And so we just felt just so much peace, and just so thankful that it was just an incidental finding. It was nothing significant, and at this point, like, they had seen enough good signs, and like his reflexes were all good, that showed like his brain was functioning fine as far as everyone could tell, and it has continued to do just that. He is a very happy, healthy baby, and we have no reason to think that there's anything wrong with his brain. And so I'm so thankful that it turned out like that, and that we were just able to go back, be discharged from the hospital later on that week, and essentially we have continued with the bottle feeding. I started seeing a lactation consultant. He was very tight, his jaw was very tight. I think from being born so quickly, he just didn't really have that much time in the birth canal to sort of stretch out. He was very tight, and so through working with a lactation consultant, we were able to figure out nursing. Thankfully, I'm so thankful that it's going much better. I did film a vlog, a day in the life with a newborn at 3 weeks postpartum, that will be live next week. I filmed it and then I have just got around to editing it now, but I touched more on our experience with that, and I'm sure it's something I'll continue to share about postpartum and just all the ins and outs of this newborn season. So make sure that you stick around for all of that. But I hope that our story can be an encouragement to you if you are expecting, if you are a new mom. I know that there's a lot of fears and anxieties that can come up around birth, and if you find yourself in that position, I hope that you can take comfort in that God is in control, that he is watching over you, he's watching over your baby, and there is not anything that has happened or will happen that is out of his control. And I think realizing that and remembering that can bring so much peace when you know that his hand is in absolutely everything, and that he is with you. He is with you when you go into labor, when you welcome that baby into the world. And so I hope that that is an encouragement to you. I am excited to share more encouragement and just things that are on my heart and mind in this season of having a newborn, of having 2 under 2, and I'm excited to share all of that in upcoming videos. So again, if you're new, I would love for you to subscribe, turn the bell notification on so that you are notified when I share future videos. Thank you so much for being here, for watching this video. Again, I hope that it was an encouragement to you, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one.